Thank you so much for coming. My name is AURICCHIO. I'm one of the 3 co-organizers of the conference, along with David Brody and Uri Talpern. You'll be meeting both of them over the course of the next couple of days. And on behalf of the co-organizers and myself, I just want to thank you all for coming. I also want to thank, this is not going to be quite as bad as the Oscars, but I do want to thank there are a lot of people involved, so I do want to give everyone the credit that they rightly deserve. This conference is co-sponsored by many different offices and programs at the university. The History Department at Lang, the New School for Liberal Arts, and the New School for Social Research. The School of Art, Design, History, and Theory at Parsons, the New School for Design. The School for Undergraduate Studies at the New School for Public Engagement. And the university-wide Global Studies program. In addition, we've had tremendous assistance from the Provost's office, the Office of Communications and External Affairs, and the Dean's office at the New School for Public Engagement. I particularly would like to thank Oz Frankel, the Associate Dean of Faculty at Lang, who came up with this idea in the very first place about a year ago, and to Oz, we are deeply grateful. Similarly grateful to Sarah Lawrence, Dean of the School of Art and Design, History, and Theory at Parsons, who has also helped to conceptualize the event and has been a tremendous supporter all the way through, and she will be introducing Tim Marshall, our provost, this evening before he introduces Barry Bergdahl. And then finally, Jeremy Varon, the chair of the History Department, who has also been instrumental in developing the program. Organizational help we've had from a large number of people, all of whom have just been invaluable, but I most particularly would like to thank Pam Tillis, who is the Director of Public Programs at the New School for Public Engagement, and her professionalism has just been invaluable at every stage of the planning and execution. So to turn from the Oscars to the intellectual framework, I will just say a couple of brief words. This conference stands at the crossroads of history, politics, and design. And this is an intersection that's particularly dear to my heart. I actually believe, as much as I believe in anything, I believe that art, design, and visual culture have the power to affect political and social change. And I also believe that it's not a luxury, but rather a crucial obligation for us to analyze the past in order to help solve the problems that we face in the present and to understand the challenges that loom in the future. And attending to this particular nexus of concerns, history and design and social change, has never, I think, been more vital. It's the only way that we'll be able to understand fully a world in which nearly every aspect of life has been designed and where visual culture has really become the most powerful global language. This intersection is also dear to the heart of the New School. And the other day, 2 of my colleagues, Julia Folks and Mark Larimore, gave a presentation on the history of the university. They've been doing a lot of archival research and have sort of really uncovered a lot of aspects of our history that we didn't know about. And they make a compelling case for placing socially engaged visual culture at the very center of the New School's narrative, almost even more so than the social sciences, one of them actually said, provocatively. They spoke about such important figures as the documentary photographer Bernice Abbott, who taught here from 1934 to 1958, the very decades when she was creating her most influential work on the rapidly changing city of New York. And that talk this week was held in a room that houses the treasure of the university's art collection. It's a room decorated with murals by the politically engaged Mexican muralist, Jose Clemente Orozco. So I see this conference carrying on that tradition. But the conference also looks toward the future of our planet, the future of our cities, and closer to home, the future of the New School. We are a university where boundaries are becoming increasingly permeable, and I think that the intersection of these 3 departments that have really come together around this conference is the prime example of that. Interdisciplinarity and interdivisional activities are becoming the norm, and the borders between our university and our universe are rapidly dissolving. So it's a very exciting time to be here, and your presence today is only making it the more so. So without further ado, let's let the excitement begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for that stirring introduction. I'd like to introduce myself. I am Ethan Robey, Assistant Professor of the History of Design and the Associate Director of the MA program in the History of Decorative Arts and Design, which is one of the master's programs in the Parsons School of Art and Design, History and Theory. And it is my pleasure to be the moderator and introductor for the first session of this very interesting symposium. Picking up where Laura left off in terms of the possibilities that design can affect social change, perhaps the most visible and we might even argue significant ways that design works with social change is in the public sphere itself, within the conception of space, shared space, built space, how we move through space. And we are pleased to have 5 presenters here who will be addressing various historical issues in that relationship, how design has in some ways molded the very conception of what space is, and how that then has further ramifications on the structure of a society. So our first speaker today is, forgive me, Nina Harkrader. Sorry. She is a Panofsky Fellow at the Institute of Fine Arts of NYU and has just come back from being a visiting scholar at NYU's Global Research Institute in London. She holds a master's degree in the archaeology of buildings from the University of York in England, and has worked in historic preservation and conservation for quite some time. At the moment, she's teaching and researching on 19th century and 20th century architecture and urbanism, and the paper she'll present today comes out of this work of analyzing buildings constructed for the poor in Great Britain at the end of the second half of the 19th century, from 1850 to about 1910, seeing how the buildings constructed are in some sense affected by and then turn around to themselves create a special set of social and even medical relationships between populations, and how the urban landscape itself is related then to social concerns. So please welcome Nina Harkrader.
Now we have a brief moment of technology while we pull up the appropriate presentation here. Okay. Success, always a good way to start. Now, the current Prime Minister of England, David Cameron, recently referred to some recipients of public assistance as being work shy, which implies that these individuals are not worthy of support. Now, neither this term nor the idea are new, as both featured prominently in Victorian-era debates on the poor. Indeed, poverty and pauperism were central to social discourse in Victorian and Edwardian England, and were in turn reflected in the built environment. Between 1850 and 1910, new buildings and building types to house, teach, and heal the poor were constructed throughout England on a scale previously unseen. This new architecture played an important role not only in defining the poor, but also in managing and reforming them, and yet it remains a subject largely unexplored to date. This is a significant oversight given the Victorian belief in environmentalism. That is to say, a person's physical surroundings, including the buildings where they were housed, taught, or healed, could affect, for better or worse, their physical health, and more importantly, their moral character. With all that in mind, I'm going to begin with a brief summary of relevant historical and social contexts, and then I'll follow that with a comparison of some architectural examples of Victorian buildings for the poor. Now, a number of you may recognize this doré illustration, which is of Dudley Street in the notoriously slum area 7 Dials in London, and it's from about 1872. Now, English ideas about the poor were paradoxical, to say the very least. While society recognized the existence of the poor, They were regarded as the other, dirty, ignorant, a largely undifferentiated mass. The upper and middling sorts had benefited from England's great economic success in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. And these classes believed that the lower sorts should support themselves, and that as long as they were willing to work, that they could support themselves. Now, it followed then that those who were very poor must not be willing to work, and were therefore both lazy and improvident. Now, these beliefs linked the poor's economic productivity to their moral status for the first time. And paradoxically, the worthy poor were those who were self-supporting, while the unworthy poor were those who needed and asked for charity. Now, an important corollary to these ideas was the widely held belief that indiscriminate charity would pauperize recipients, discouraging them from working and making them dependent on handouts. Now, in capitalist Victorian England, eradicating pauperism was therefore of central importance, and thus it was critical to separate the unworthy pauper poor from the worthy and industrious poor. Now, what's striking in the literature of the time is the medicalized language used not only to describe the unworthy poor, but to render them culpable for their own poor health and financial position. Now, many scholars, Gilbert, Hamlin, Wall, for example, agree that the 1832 cholera epidemic represents a crisis point in 19th century Britain. In the wake of the epidemic, then medical inspector of Manchester, James Phillips Kay, published the influential The Moral and Physical Condition of the Working Classes, in which he explicitly linked these two conditions with references such as, and I quote, the contagious example of ignorance and barbarous regard of thoughtful economy of the poor, or their, quote, licentiousness capable of corrupting the whole of society, like a contagious disease. Now, Kay's work typifies the early to mid-19th century view of the unworthy poor. Their pauper state not only resulted from their own moral failings, but this condition, like the many physical diseases which accompanied it, was both contagious and dangerous to society as a whole. Now, in fact, evidence suggests that the treatment of the poor was actually closely related to the prevailing disease model of the period, miasmic or miasmatic theory, which is the belief that filth and decay gave rise to bad air, which in turn caused illness. The proponents of miasmic theory argued that sanitarian practices, primarily cleaning up the filth, decaying matter, and human waste that caused miasmas, would in turn prevent diseases. And I'm showing you here a famous cartoon from Punch magazine, the scientist Faraday presenting his card to Father Thames. And of course, if you notice, there's a great deal of decaying matter and offal floating in the Thames. Father Thames himself is looking rather dirty, shall we say. So mid-century Victorians are thus concentrating not on curing individuals of disease, but on cleaning the larger physical environment by removing the kinds of nuisances that you're seeing here, and also by developing sewerage. Now, in turn, they cleansed the moral environment by refusing charity to unworthy paupers, sending them instead to the punitive workhouse. There, families were separated, and inmates were confined to large wards, earning their meager diet and shelter by physical labor. Now, I'm showing you here an 1862 map of London. You are in St. Pancras Parish. Some of you will recognize Regent's Park, that large green space off to my left. And the red arrow is pointing to the site of the St. Pancras Workhouse, which is going to serve as one of our sites to examine today. This is an 1815 illustration of the workhouse. It was the first purpose-built workhouse in the parish, and built in about 1809. And it pretty much stood until about 1889, which is the date of this photo. Now, what you're seeing from that illustration in the 1889 photo, we know it was about 2 stories tall. It was constructed of brick. It was shaped like a U in plan, with the short side of the U facing the street and the arms facing backwards, if you will. And it had a central pavilion entrance, which you are actually looking at now. Now, in general, it was representative of the sort of late 18th century, early 19th century workhouse, just to give you a sense of what some of these other buildings looked like. This is an illustration of the Liverpool workhouse, which was built about 1770, and a workhouse in Suffolk, built about 1780. You're seeing similar facades, similar materials, and so on and so forth. Let's go back and look at St. Pancras briefly again, just to remind you. Now, it's difficult to see in this photo, but it will be easier to see on the next image I'm showing you, which is that 1862. Here's an 1862 site plan. And now you'll recognize that the large building at the top of the image is that brick building that you were just looking at. So what I'd like you to notice here is the separation of the buildings on the site, and in particular, the main building from the streetscape and from the surrounding neighborhood. That's a point to which I am going to return later. Now, while plans don't survive for this building, documentary sources suggest that it likely contained dormitories, workrooms, offices, storerooms, infirmaries, pretty much all under one roof. But by the mid-19th century, additional buildings appeared on the site, and you can see some of them here. Again, the main block in the center, off to the right of the main block, to the back, and then off to the left. As far as we can tell from the documentary evidence, it suggested that one of those buildings was a small infirmary building, another might have been a school building for the children. But the documentary sources are still suggesting that all of the adult residents are contained in the large workhouse block that you saw originally. Men and women, separate wards, but not in separate buildings at this period. Now, by the last third of the 19th century, a new disease model termed germ theory, which held that disease was caused by a specific agent, was becoming prevalent. So thus, beginning in the 1870s, disease models begin to focus less on environmental surroundings and more on so-called original or source cases. While commitment to sanitarian principles continues, the identification of individual cases, followed by the isolation of an afflicted person in a hospital ward, becomes prevalent. Now, at the same time, a noticeable change in poverty theory also occurs. State and charitable policies towards the poor increasingly focus on the individual's responsibility to act in a productive and moral way. So determining the worthiness of the recipient of charity becomes even more important. Many worthy poor, widows with children, for example, found they no longer qualified for charity, while the unworthy poor were reclassified into smaller, more specific, and much more explicitly moralistic categories than they had been previously. And my favorite is able-bodied women of bad character, for example. So, partly as a result, workhouse regimes at the same time become even more punitive. They begin to hire professional staff, there are increasing labor requirements, much more enforcement of stringent restrictions on behavior within the workhouse, and so on. And the architecture responds. This increased subdivision and classification of the unworthy poor is accompanied by a separation of the classes, each into its own segregated space in the workhouse. And in fact, I would argue that this new model of disease, whereby illness was caused by discrete sources that must be isolated, identified, and treated, was developing concomitantly with this new theory of poverty in which the poor themselves were increasingly categorized, isolated, and treated for the disease of pauperism. So now I'm showing you on the left is an 1871 plan of the St. Pancras site, and you'll be familiar by now with that right-hand plan. I've merely reoriented it so that both plans have a similar orientation, and you can see how the site has changed. So at this point, if we compare these two plans from 1862 and 1871, there are definitely some changes that are already present, and I've pointed out some of them actually with the yellow arrows in the circle on the left. The yellow arrows are referring to new buildings that have been constructed on the site, as does the circle. And what has happened is that these new buildings have very specific functions now, which is a departure from the previous history of the site. In addition, if you look carefully, you'll see that that site, your left-hand 1871 site plan, is very clearly showing fences and other means of separation so that the different sections of the site are now divided in addition to putting different functions of buildings and different people in different buildings. Now, by the time we get to 1889, and again, now you're looking at what I need you to understand is that the majority of buildings on this site are new. So if you are not recognizing things from the previous plan, do not despair. It's actually changed. But basically what has happened at this point is the site has been divided into male and female sides. And what you find, if you look at the very top, for example, where it says male dining room, the entire left-hand side of that site is now devoted to the male members of the workhouse inmates, whereas the women have now been segregated to the right-hand side. So this is unusual. In addition, you are now seeing a series of dormitory blocks, if you look over to the right-hand side of the site, which will be specifically designated for particular types of poor. You're going to have your able-bodied women, for example, are all now going to be in a particular dormitory block. And this is a significant change from the previous site. Now here I'm actually showing you some of these buildings do survive. And what you're seeing here at the top is the small infirmary for the aged women. But more importantly, what you're seeing to the left are examples in the midground of that image of dormitory blocks. So at St. Pancras over time, what we've had are the unworthy poor being subjected to an increasingly stringent social program, which is reflected in the workhouse buildings themselves. Well, now, what about those worthy poor? You remember we talked about them at the very beginning, who often lived in conditions very similar to the unworthy poor. Now, you'll recall that the Victorian environmentalist beliefs earlier mentioned about the role of site and architecture. Well, these become an important catalyst in the so-called model dwellings movement, whereby buildings were built and let, and they were better quality accommodation for the worthy poor at market rents during the mid to late 19th century. And I'm showing you one of the earliest ones, sadly destroyed during World War II. This is an illustration of the builder from so-called metropolitan buildings, which were pretty much down the street from the St. Pancras workhouse, giving us a subject for another day in terms of locating the poor specifically in the urban fabric. Now, it was believed that these clean, carefully organized, and managed dwellings would accomplish two things. First, the worthy and industrious poor would be removed from that degenerate physical and moral surroundings where the paupers lived. And second, the buildings themselves would provide a healthy environment that reinforced good and industrious behavior, so those tenants might continue to be productive members of society. Now, there were tenants' rules that also reinforced this behavior, and they ranged from immediate eviction for non-payment of weekly rent to appropriate sites to hang laundry. And I'm showing you a recent photograph that I took of a sign on a Peabody estate in London. These are still inhabited by tenants. And you can see pretty much that there's very little that you can actually do in the open area in the middle of the site. No cycling, roller skating, cricket, footballing, no hawkers, canvases, no street musicians. You know, pretty much no fun is the order of the day. Now, given the careful attention to, or you might even say obsession with, the worthiness of the poor that the Victorians show, it's notable that model dwellings seem to resemble workhouse architecture in a formal sense. Certainly, you could say that the exteriors are very, very similar. So let's go back and have a look. Sorry. You remember this sketch of the St. Pancras workhouse. Interesting. Brick, long facade, very little ornamentation. This is a photograph of the metropolitan buildings taken from about 1936. Again, same materials, little decoration, repetitive fenestration, very simple block-like structure. I'm showing you again, just reminding you those dormitory buildings. I think you're beginning to see there's a common theme here with these buildings. Here's another one. This is Clarendon Square, also in St. Pancras Parish, and it was built about 1876. And one more. This is a different Peabody Trust estate, which is on Herbrand Street on the edge of Bloomsbury, constructed in about 1885. This is a 1956 photo, and those buildings are still there, and they are pretty much identical to the photograph itself. Now, more importantly, perhaps, one thing we could say also is the fact that there are spatial similarities in terms of model dwellings and in terms of workhouses. And here I'm showing you an 1894 site plan of the St. Pancras workhouse, which illustrates this, a number of things. First of all, again, the site is separated from its urban fabric. The buildings themselves are separate from each other. You can see they're organized in a rather regimented fashion on the site, and there are fences and yards separating each building one from another, and so on. So if we were to have a look, for example, at St. Pancras Square. Now, this is the earliest one, so we're only beginning to see a little bit of separation. It's the large block-like set of buildings in the left side. What's behind it is actually the remnants of a neighborhood. But you see already, again, separation, fences, air. This is that Clarendon Square site that I showed you from the 1870s. Now, again, very regimented, block-like, separate from the rest of the neighborhood. And those small spaces, you can see the dotted line around the site represents a fence. These small spaces that are indicated show that the site actually had gates into the fence itself. So we're seeing elements of separation, we're seeing fences, walls, and enclosed yards, we're seeing gated entrances. Well, it gets even more interesting. Now we are looking at a ground plan from the model housing on Streatham Street. This is the ground floor, and the red arrow is showing you that there is a keeper's office, and the bottom is illustrating how the keeper can see through the window into the only entrance into the building yard. So he can surveil pretty much everybody who is coming in and leaving. So now we're also getting elements of surveillance. Interesting. Aren't these supposed to be worthy poor? We can go further with this, and we can look at, now you're seeing the interior courtyard of that previous plan from Streatham Street, and what you're seeing there are balconies or galleries exterior, and basically you can see from this particular viewpoint in the courtyard, you can see the door to every single flat. So you can see who's leaving and who's entering. And on the bottom, I'm showing you something called Cobden Buildings. This is King's Cross Road, a 1978 photo of an 1860 building. And if you look carefully, what you're going to see is at the bottom, you enter the staircase, each of the arched openings on each of the balconies is the continuance of the staircase. So the staircase is, for the most part, an exterior staircase. Again, you can see who's leaving, you can see who's arriving. Now, staircases start out initially closed and internal, but they very quickly become external. And those galleries have replaced interior hallways to give access to tenant flats. So I would argue that this architecture, and again, we're back to our friends in metropolitan buildings, that this architecture contradicts Victorian statements about the worthiness of the industrious poor and suggests that these Victorian social ideas and programs need to be re-examined in light of this discovery. Now, clearly this is only the beginning, and this subject has a huge number of potential areas for reassessment. There is, of course, the question of resistance to the authorities' regime. Did the inmates of the workhouse and the residents of the model dwellings actually follow these rules? Or we could say, did the explicit social programs embodied in the buildings actually work? More importantly, I alluded to interior space. And there are spatial analysis such as access and view shed analysis, Hillier and Hansen, and Thomas Marcus, which would allow us to compare different floor plans of these different model dwellings and investigate how accessible each section of the building was and how the interior space might have functioned. But in the end, I think the contradictory aspects of Victorian poverty theory and the resultant architecture for the poor are quite intriguing, and I think they're also relevant to current debates that we're having now. Thank you.
I couldn't help but notice the uncomfortable familiarity, some of those ideas about poverty and whose fault it is and all that sort of stuff. But perhaps we'll leave that for after discussion. Now I'd like to introduce our very own Joanna Merwood. Joanna is the Associate Professor of Architectural History here at Parsons, the New School for Design. She has a doctorate from Princeton, and has authored many books and edited other books on architecture and design, including she was the author of Chicago, 1890, The Skyscraper in the Modern City, co-editor of Aftertaste, Expanded Practice in Interior Design. She's published in many journals, etc. What she's going to be talking about today, however, is right down the street, Union Square, a highly contested space in New York City history. Originally built as a kind of quiet park, but very quickly in the 19th century becomes a site of social unrest, this place for May Day celebrations and whatnot. And what Professor Merwood's paper will be dealing with largely is early 20th century attempts by the New York City Parks Department to transform the space by means of instituting a whole set of memorials to war, the Battle of Independence, George Washington, etc. And by so doing, transform the inherent built meaning of the space as a measure of a kind of social control. So, Joanna Merwood.
Thank you, Ethan, and thank you also to Laura and David for organising such a rich and fascinating conference. I'm really looking forward to the next couple of days tremendously. As Laura mentioned in her introduction, this conference asks us to consider design as a historical agent, to look in particular at the relationships amongst design, history, and revolution. The paper that I want to present today examines Union Square in New York City as a politically charged public space, one in which design has been historically deployed to both support and undermine the constitutional rights of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. Most people are familiar with the square's reputation as a place for public dissent dating back to the 19th century. The image that you're looking at here is a newspaper photograph of a May Day celebration in Union Square almost 100 years ago in 1908. The title of my paper, Red Mobs Battle Police, is taken from a New York Times headline from 1929, which reports on a confrontation between police and members of the American Communist Party on the same site. What I want to do today is to examine the history of Union Square as both an intentionally designed public space, that is, as a physical entity, and also as a symbol of competing ideas about the operation of democracy, so a kind of physical space and also a symbolic space. As Ethan mentioned, of particular interest to me is Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux's 1872 redesign of the square, and it's their building that you can see in the middle of this image, the cottage, which no longer exists. Olmsted and Vaux's design for Union Square can be seen as a powerful counterexample to their work in Central Park, I'm going to argue. While Central Park is an American version of the romantic pseudo-natural landscape popularized in the 18th century, Union Square is small and formal in its design. There's not much written about it because it really is not very interesting from a landscape design or an urban design point of view. It's not innovative in any way. But what's interesting to me is that where Central Park was designed to foster a very particular idea of 19th century American democracy, Union Square found its prominence sort of by accident. It began as an elite enclave on the edge of the city and only later assumed significance as a prominent public space. Analysis of Union Square as a site for dissent raises significant questions about the nature of and relationships among design, history, and revolution. When speaking of urban design, who's empowered to act and for whom are they designing? Whose history do we choose to remember through design and how do we do it? And finally, how's design for remembrance of the past related to design for action in the present? So to begin with the beginning, this is an image pre-Union Square. The square's real and symbolic importance is an accident. It wasn't part of the original Manhattan grid. In 1807, the commissioners charged with platting the city north of Houston Street had no intention of creating any kind of public space that resembled traditional European squares or their idealized American counterparts in Philadelphia, Savannah, and Washington, D.C. To do so would have been antithetical to their goals. The relentless and homogeneous grid was designed to foster efficient land development. Contemptuous of urban planning affectations such as circles, ovals, and stars, the commissioners were reluctant to provide public gathering spaces for any purpose except pure utility, such as markets, a military parade ground, and an observatory. In their plan, Union Place, the triangular open lot which we can see on this map, was created to deal with the union of several irregular streets between 14th and 17th Streets along the path of Broadway. Though Union Square wasn't part of the original grid, it has its origins in the same impulse as a prompt for commercial development. In 1830, the owners of property around the place petitioned the New York State Legislature and the Common Council to enlarge the place for use as a 3-acre elliptical park. Their lobbying was successful, and in 1832 the council began landscaping Union Square, as it was renamed, into an elliptical shape. In future years, this park would come to answer a growing desire for the kinds of public spaces disallowed in the Commissioner's plan. Union Square as we know it today was created incrementally over nearly 2 centuries, as the square slowly transformed from a neighbourhood amenity to a site with national significance. In 1842, the large fountain seen here in this print was installed to celebrate the opening of the Croton Aqueduct. In 1856 and 1870, respectively, statues of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln were erected on the southwest and southeastern corners. And I just want to point out here that they were originally erected outside the park in the middle of a sort of traffic island, if you will, and this would change later on. The square entered the American consciousness as a significant public space during the Civil War. Following the attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861, it was the location of a mass rally when huge crowds gathered around the statue of Washington in support of the Union cause. The spectacle of this enormous crowd waving flags and listening to speeches was captured and quickly disseminated through images in newspapers and magazines, and Union Square became associated with the preservation of the Republic. In 1864, Samuel Ruggles, a real estate developer who had been active in creating the square, gave a patriotic speech rewriting its history in the process. Ruggles argued that the road to American nationhood ran right through Union Square. General Washington, he said, had ridden up Broadway through the site of the square in his retreat from the English forces in 1776, only to return along the same route to reclaim the city 7 years later. In his florid Victorian speech, Ruggles laid claim to Union Square not as a cartographic byproduct, but as an intentionally planned monument to the political ideals of the nation. This is what he said. Enclosing nothing but open space, the very creation of God himself, which is interesting because Ruggles was one of the creators, putting himself in a high position. The creation of God himself, subject to no decay and impervious to the tooth of time. Union Square is destined, like the square of imperial Trajan in the eternal city, to remain for all coming time the type or model of our continental union and the bright and imperishable jewel of the city. It is a theatre adequate to the national voice. Ruggles' rhetorical vision of Union Square as a monument to the American Revolution and to American democracy and to free speech gained traction in 1872 when landscape architects Olmsted and Vaux were commissioned to renovate it. Many authors have described a contradiction between Olmsted's democratic impulse and the elite nature of the activity he imagined taking place in his parks. While far more modest than his plan for Central Park, his work at Union Square reveals his willingness to accommodate emerging practices of mass culture into landscape design. So this is my argument. This is the other side of Olmsted that we haven't really seen before. Olmsted and Vaux saw immediately that the square's original quiet and leafy character was under threat from the crowds who regularly blocked the surrounding streets and trampled the plants. The use of the square as a staging area for public celebrations and protests became increasingly at odds with its original purpose as a suburban park. So this is partly to do with the transformation of the city. This area around Union Square is no longer a residential area, it's really a commercial area with lots of theatres and stores. What you're looking at here is an image drawn up prior to Olmsted and Vaux's involvement. It was drawn up by some Parks Department landscape architects, and what they proposed to do was basically to take down the iron fence around the square to make it more accessible and therefore more sort of porous to the crowds surrounding it. And when Olmsted and Vaux took on this project, they didn't really alter the major part of this design. The planting was left pretty much as it is in this plan. More significantly, however, they suggested creating a separate zone at the northern end along 17th Street specifically for public assembly. So the area that we know now, which is mainly used for the farmers market, was a creation of Olmsted and Vaux. This was a wide paved area that they called a muster ground. It was in effect a third space between the inner park, which was preserved as a planted landscape, and the busy streets surrounding it. A space sanctioned for public gathering, defined by paving and decorative iron fences and lampposts, the muster ground was centred on a small neo-Gothic building called the Cottage. Following their construction, the muster ground and the cottage at Union Square were used for all kinds of gatherings, from 4th of July and Columbus Day parades to labour marches. The most famous of these, of course, is the first Labour Day parade that took place on 5th of September 1882, which is seen here in this image. After Tompkins Square Park in the Lower East Side was closed following the riot of 1874, the more centrally located Union Square became the destination for working class political marches. Situated between the sweatshops on the Lower East Side and the department stores of Ladies' Mile, between the sites of production and consumption, if you will, it was ideally suited as a place to promote working class solidarity. This space was successful as a forum for working class protest and became associated with American radicalism around the turn of the 20th century, to the consternation of the Parks Department and the City Council. Of particular concern was the fact that some of these mass meetings appeared to promote violent social revolution, constituting a threat to democracy rather than its visible exercise. And what you're looking at here is two news photographs of a May Day, the same one that I had in the title slide, a May Day gathering by the Socialist Conference for the Unemployed in 1908. The next day, the New York Times reported that at 3:30 p.m. a bomb exploded prematurely in the hands of a Williamsburg anarchist. Those are always the worst kind. He was killed and several others were wounded, unfortunately. Events such as this called the nature of protests in Union Square into question. Were they bona fide political demonstrations sanctioned by the Constitution, or were they illegal and seditious? The turn of the 20th century marked the beginning of 5 decades of work on the part of the Parks Department, the City Council, and local business groups to take back ownership of Union Square from labour unions and radical groups. The city had at its disposal various legal mechanisms for controlling activity. It could and did deny permits, including one for the demonstration seen here, and the police force was actively involved in monitoring and restricting activity. However, these efforts didn't stop with legal means. The Parks Department began a campaign to deploy iconography in the form of built elements and statuary in order to reposition the cultural meaning of the square. During World War I, for example, authorities countered anti-war demonstrations with their own patriotic symbol, the USS Recruit, which was a mock battleship constructed almost at full scale to house a military recruiting centre right in the middle of Union Square. This was a temporary solution, and it was made possible because the entire square was in the process of being demolished and rebuilt, as I'll describe later. The construction of a new subway concourse provided the opportunity to rebrand Union Square more permanently, to reinforce the association between the square and the 18th century War of Independence and the Civil War, rather than the cause of international socialism. As the subway concourse was constructed underneath, the entire park was raised and reconstructed on a platform elevated 3 feet above the surrounding streets. The statues of Washington and Lincoln were relocated from their original positions on the periphery into the central axis of the park, as you can see here, and I'm going to be obnoxious and use my pointer if I can. So Washington was originally here and he was moved here. Lincoln was originally here and he was moved here, and this is where they still stand, Washington and Lincoln. A new focal point was provided in the form of the Liberty or Tammany flagpole, which is also still there, which is right here, which was erected in 1926 to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The base of the flagpole is inscribed with the entire Declaration of Independence, and also with a quote from Thomas Jefferson, and I quote, "How little do my countrymen know what precious blessings they're in possession of and which no other people on earth enjoy." So that's a message to the demonstrators. Don't you know how lucky you are? The centennial of Union Square in 1932 provided another opportunity for the staging of patriotism. On April 23rd, the citizens of New York City celebrated the centennial with a pageant that included an historical tableau with figures in period dress, a massed chorus of high school students, an outdoor Americanization meeting sponsored by the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and a series of maneuvers by members of the police academy, including a riot drill. This celebration centered on the newly constructed neoclassical stone and concrete building draped with American flag bunting seen here. Described as a combined bandstand and comfort station, this stood on the site of Olmsted and Vaux's cottage, which was demolished. The message was hard to miss. Union Square was being remade as a passive memorial to the patriotic ideals under which the nation was founded, and its contemporary use as a place to enact democratic action was being actively discouraged. The 1920s attempt to rewrite the meaning of Union Square through landscape design prefigured a series of similar episodes throughout the square's 20th century history. For example, in 1942, the Parks Department installed a car park on the site of Olmsted and Vaux's muster ground, severely inhibiting its use as a place of public gathering. The most recent reimagining of Union Square, begun in the 1980s, had the same agenda as the centennial celebration of 1932, a desire to promote the kinds of gentle urban leisure that appeals to middle-class users, strolling, playing, shopping, at the expense of more active political gatherings. Ironically, this renovation prompted calls to preserve the 1932 bandstand for public use rather than conversion to a private restaurant. The original purpose of this building, as part of a plan to rebrand the square as a place for passive leisure rather than active debate, has been forgotten. It shows how short memory is. We want to love this building now, whereas it was the source of absolute contempt for anybody of leftist persuasion when it was built. As the events I've described here demonstrate, Union Square, a small open ground in the middle of Manhattan, formed by a misalignment of the 1811 grid, has historically been contested terrain. More than just formally mutable, it's been the site of debate about the definition, design, proper use, and policing of public space that stretched from the early 19th century until today. Accidental, unpremeditated, and continually in the process of being reconstructed, it's never been an example of innovative urban design, and yet it expresses, perhaps more than any other urban landscape, how political ideals are realized in reality. Thank you.
And thank you, Joanna. And then, keeping the theme of designing New York City itself, I'd like to introduce Amanda, please forgive me, Glubidzi, who is a doctoral candidate in the history of art at Ohio State University, where she specializes in modern and contemporary art and design history. Her dissertation is on 1960s New York, and today she'll be speaking from that research. From that research. Doesn't matter where it's from as long as it's good. No, it's going to be a very interesting talk. I'm very curious to hear this about a 1972 exhibition called Making New York Understandable, held at the city's Cultural Center, which came up with a series of design solutions to what was by that point already, of course, New York going into a kind of a crisis mode. Design solutions, few of which were ever put into production, and those which were put into production were roundly criticized for various reasons that we'll get into. So ultimately, the paper will raise the question of how can cities be actively designed? Can design really revolutionize cities? And how would that process work? So please welcome Amanda Glubidzi.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for being here to listen, and I'm excited to hear everybody's talks. By most account, New York was an unpleasant, dirty, and even dangerous location to live in the 1960s and 70s. Through a combination of population decline, governmental neglect, and bureaucratic tangles, New York City reverted to a seemingly ungovernable and unlivable place. In official literature, as well as the popular media, such as this, seen here, New York was portrayed as a city that was broken. Designers had already begun to examine the problems facing New York City's built environment in earnest in the mid-1960s, teaming with urban planners, the mayor's office, and architects to devise solutions via visual communication. However, designers also began to understand that their own expertise would be called upon to complete these tasks. As the designer William McCaffrey wrote, quote, "Those of us who live and work in this growing confusion of a city can't sit back and expect a mayor or a governor or more policemen to solve our problems, particularly if we are art directors and designers and writers and photographers and filmmakers, i.e. communicators. We're the ones who must face up to the responsibility of relating our work to the lives we live and the life we observe around us. We must apply our skills and tools to the job of giving form and order and meaning to urban processes. By making the city even a bit more understandable, we make it a bit more livable," end quote. By the early 1970s, the problems facing New York seemed to have reached some sort of breaking point. And in the fall of 1972, an exhibition ran at the New York Cultural Center, aka the Lollipop Building, in Columbus Circle that was intended to address these problems. Making New York Understandable, a graphic design exhibition sponsored by the Art Directors Club and featured in a special issue of Print devoted to the design solutions included in the show. Making New York Understandable grew out of several years of dialogue surrounding the possibility that design could improve life in New York. For example, in 1967, designers, educators, and politicians met in Central Park for a design-in. Although the event associated the visual communication developed by designers with the vernacular designs, such as placards and flyers, created by protesters, and borrowed language from international protest movements such as sit-ins, in which protesters occupied places associated with authority and shut them down by these passive actions, the design-in was jointly sponsored by New York University, the New York chapter of the Industrial Designers Society of America, and New York City's Department of Parks. Undoubtedly, a political event developed jointly by protesters and public officials would have been anathema to other protests. But this interaction between designer-occupier and the authorities, whether political or industrial, is typical of the design protest movements of this time. Such cooperation was undoubtedly cynical, as admin and art directors surely understood the power of selling their products to those with discretionary power over city budgets, but there was also a sense of common purpose shared between politicians and designers. Mayor John Lindsay, for example, told a reporter from Print magazine that he was, quote, "deeply convinced of the contribution that graphic design, in the broadest sense, can make toward a more human and humane environment," end quote. Perhaps, too, the comfort with the authorities was the result of designers' own belief that working within the system would be most profitable to their movement. One of the design-in participants observed that, quote, "the most difficult thing is to work within an establishment and continue to try to subvert it," end quote. Designers' work required them to negotiate with businesses and city offices alike. However, by the time of making New York Understandable, designers despaired of convincing politicians to implement fully and to install their designs as they created them. For example, Unimark International's work for the Transit Authority's subway signage was never executed as the firm had intended. Instead, the signs were painted rather than manufactured according to earlier renderings of the system and were installed in areas that had not been indicated by Unimark's location studies. Furthermore, older signs, such as this one, remained alongside the new designs. Thus, as the members of the Art Directors Club saw it, New York's greatest problems were those of navigation, communication, and implementation. In the opening statement of the special issue of Print published to accompany the exhibition, Richard Saul Werman, one of its exhibitors and one of the instigators of the exhibit, included what amounted to a mission statement for the show. Quote, "We live in the ununderstandable city, a place where public information is not public, a place that is not maintained because it is not creatively used. We have avoided our responsibilities to the city," end quote. An ununderstandable urban environment without information made available to its citizenry could never be used efficiently because this prohibited people from improving their experiences of that city. Calling the city ununderstandable, too, only underscored the ugliness of the situation. Formed from a group of admin, copywriters, and signage designers, the members of the Art Directors Club were dedicated to finding elegant solutions to marketing and wayfinding. An ununderstandable city was one in which communication was impossible. It was literally unreadable. The conviction that New York was a city that could not be understood stemmed in part from designers' appropriation of the concept of cognitive mapping, as discussed by Kevin Lynch in The Image of the City from 1960. Lynch noted that cities were more understandable to people if they were navigable via landmarks and monuments, be they naturally occurring or man-made. Although Manhattan's street grid should have made the city unproblematic for navigation, a combination of factors prevented its understandability. For example, the grid pattern broke down in the oldest parts of the city, making the cardinal directions that were usually simple to determine via the equation of numbered streets to avenues more complicated to establish. The subway system was actually 3 different train systems that had only recently been combined. Finally, navigation in Manhattan was complex because of that feature so characteristic to the city, its skyscrapers. Because of the density of New York's skyline, canyons formed on the avenues between the tall buildings, rendering navigation by monument essentially impossible. Thus, faced with a breakdown of regularized paths, conflicting routes above and below ground, and pedestrians trapped in the perceptual narrows between buildings, it made sense that the designers of the Art Directors Club would turn to graphic design problem solving to create alternative monuments to those visually inaccessible landmarks. The solution to such problems, for graphic designers at least, lay in communications and sign systems, several of which, including Unimark's proposals for the subway signage and also for the 53rd Street corridor, an example of which you see here, New York Magazine's pocket guides that were printed and tipped into the print magazine itself, and the massive 6-volume plan for New York City, produced by the City Planning Commission, were on display in Making New York Understandable. In her review of the exhibition, published in New York Magazine, the art critic Barbara Rose noted the need for such civic solutions. But even while acknowledging the city's desperation for such services as the Art Directors Club suggested, and applauding the designers for offering them when the city itself seemed to have lost interest in doing so, Rose remained suspicious of the social controls implied by the solutions. Her mistrust was prompted by her wariness of the designers' use of language and letters. Quote, "Promising so much and delivering so little, their exhibition exposes the inability of media people to communicate real information. Confusing and unfocused, the displays look and read like ad copy, which has never been a means of communication, but a means of psychological manipulation." End quote. Rose's review was apposite, as it exposed the organizers' own fears for the receptions of their master plans, legible signage, shelters, and maps, that they would not fix anything, that they would be seen only as cosmetic, that they were in the end only decoration. Indeed, Walter Kasich, the designer between recently designed sanitation department signage and street furniture, protested, "We didn't want to contribute to the general Christmas tree effect you see in the city." He was notoriously actually unsuccessful in that these curb your dog signs were stolen as soon as they were put up. This despair was, perhaps surprisingly, admitted to in print's coverage of Making New York Understandable. The last page of the special issue was devoted to a note of frustration. Quote, "If the solutions posed on the preceding pages remind us that it is possible to make New York understandable, we also have to be reminded that they are still far more the exception than the rule. The rule is pretty much the sort of informational mishmash called a map/guide that the New York transit system hands out to hapless subway riders. We defy you to find your way to Brooklyn without having to pore over this guide for half a day," end quote. Even as the editors lamented the probability that many of the projects they featured in the exhibition and the magazine would not come to fruition, they saw one reason for hope. The description of New York's current subway map ended with an asterisk, which pointed to this note, As we go to press, we learn that the Metropolitan Transit Authority has replaced the old, unreadable subway map with a new, more legible one. Hooray! The subway map to which the editors referred was the infamous map designed by Massimo Vignelli and Unimark International. In 1972, before any concerted installation of the signage system designed by Unimark had taken place, the MTA released the corresponding map. Vignelli's subway map was unlike any previous New York subway guide and is unlike the map used today. Rather than drawing from the geography of New York's boroughs and indicating the streets under which the subway lines run, the designer borrowed from the London Underground map and created instead a diagrammatic representation of the entire system, thus setting aside geographic space for graphic space. London's map, designed in 1931 by Harry Beck, removes all references to the city above the subway, with the exception of the Thames, which orients its user in terms of the cardinal directions, although strictly speaking, even that isn't necessary because when you're underground, who cares which way is north? In so doing, the subway lines themselves take precedence over the corresponding city. Vignelli's map attempted the same, bringing 3 different train companies running across multiple boroughs into a single entity called the subway. The 1972 map, in addition to removing street names, skewed the geography of Manhattan, making the island appear squatter and fatter to better permit the map lines representing the train lines to run smoothly and uninterruptedly. This geographic distortion led to further warping. On the Vignelli map, Central Park is represented as a square rather than a rectangle. And in order to develop visual coherence and promote ease of use, the map's color scheme was strictly regimented. The overlying city footprint was rendered in shades of beige, with parks a gray or brown, and the water surrounding the island tinted a darker shade of tan. All of New York was subsumed to the colors of the subway lines, which were themselves anchored to the colors Vignelli had already assigned them as part of the signage plan. The initial response to the maps was ecstatic. The New York Times reported that the new map was a best non-seller, with many of the 1.5 million copies of the first edition taken by travelers in the very first day they were distributed. An advance reviewer of the map reported that, quote, "Each route flows on the maps as majestically as the Mississippi to the sea, in its own solid, unbroken color," end quote. However, New York subway stations are, in fact, psychologically, if not always strictly geographically, tied to the streets under which they run and the monuments that are associated above them. And the development of a diagrammatic map proved unworkable for New York City. At its worst, it was read as a willful refusal to acknowledge the city it served. Fairly quickly, qualms were raised about the cynical reality of the color scheme of the Vignelli map, which seemed to suggest that New York's waterways and parks were, in actuality, mostly brown and gray. New subway maps were called for that returned to cartographic verities, such as a rectangular Central Park, instead of giving the viewer-user only the spaghetti, as Vignelli would have it. Even the color of the lines was called into question. For some critics, the colors were not differentiated enough, leading to beliefs that people following them would be led astray. But for others, the problems of the subway map's colors were just as the designers behind making New York understandable feared. They were only Christmas trees. In a 1978 article calling for the map's revisions, Paul Goldberger noted that, quote, "The Vignelli map, a variant of which is still in use today, was at once the best and the worst of the attempts to bring order to the subways. Here, the colors used for each line became rich and almost luscious. The entire subway system looks like a skillfully drafted exercise in polychromy, as if a draftsman had attempted to echo a Morris Louis painting," end quote. The subway map was called out for making the city once again ununderstandable. Not art and not useful design, according to its critics, it was decried as design playing at being art. To its critics, it was merely decorative. In 1979, it was replaced, the geography of the city reinstated. In the end, none of the non-commercial projects featured in making New York understandable was realized as the designers had envisioned them, except for the subway map. And although the Vignelli map was discontinued after only 7 years after its introduction, its fame as an object has lived on. Its beauty and even its purported unusability have turned it from a disappointment into an icon. Stripped from its context and its use, it is now hung on walls, acquired by museums, and treasured by collectors. In 2011, the MTA reintroduced the Vignelli map after a fashion. Relabeled The Weekender, the map now exists only virtually and serves, perhaps justly, to tell of mistakes, delays, and disruptions in service via blinking lights on the digital map. On some weekends, the MTA communications director has said the map might be, quote, lit up like a Christmas tree. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. That was wonderful. Next up is Jonah Westerman from the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, where he is a doctoral candidate in the program of art history. His research tends on the ways that art's political capacity has been imagined and constructed, and is now writing a dissertation about the relationship between the technologies of mediation and subjectivity in European performance art and contemporary era. But today we'll be talking about the Moscow subway system, especially the Moscow subway system in the 1930s and the Stalinist era, and how it functions as both a site of all the urban aspirations of Stalin's modernization reforms, but also a kind of liminal space somehow on the threshold, being both the new but inextricably also the old. So welcome, please, Jonah Westerman.
Thanks for that. And while I pull this up, thanks to the organizers for inviting me, and I'm very excited for the way that I think that this paper will actually work well with the others, which isn't always the case. Okay, and I'm calling it Hurry Up and Wait, Socialist Realism, Avant-Garde, and the Poetics of the Threshold in the Moscow Metro. Building on Lenin's famous formula, communism equals Soviet power plus the electrification of the entire country, art historian and theorist Boris Groys asserts that, quote, the electrified night is the only true daytime of utopia, end quote. Here, Groys is talking about the Moscow Metro and the position it occupied as chief repository of utopian aspirations of the Stalinist regime. Following Groys's lead, and arguably Stalin's as well, this paper takes the Metro as both object and metaphor for analyses of the Soviet reconstruction of society during the 1930s. At stake is a discussion of the particular type of new man the Soviet utopia sought to produce, by what means this was attempted, and what it might mean to consider the venture a success. This paper will discuss what the Metro was meant to achieve practically and signify ideologically, and it will examine the Metro's design and construction. Looking to the theoretical frameworks proposed by Groys and Alain Badiou for considering the art avant-garde drive to rupture and newness, this paper will demonstrate that the Moscow Metro, as a product of socialist realism designed to usher in the new by selectively destroying or repurposing the old, inhabits a peculiar threshold temporality that renders the present insubstantial and all its travelers more static than mobile. The earliest attempts to plan a subway in Moscow date to 1897, but not until the spring of 1931, which is to say, after the firm consolidation of Stalin's government, did anything ever happen. In 1931, Stalin appointed Lazar Kaganovich to take control of the project and ensure results. In an address to the plenum of the Central Committee of that June, Kaganovich tied the fate of the Metro to the revitalization of Moscow and the modernization of Moscow to the success of the Soviet Union. He underlined the importance of turning Moscow, newly made capital of the Soviet Union in 1918, into a world-class city. The Moscow was immediately positioned as a potential symbol of progress, a metaphor for the party, and a metonym for Stalin himself. Bearing all this in mind, the bureau in charge of the metro's design and construction, the Metrostroy, set to work. Even though it posed much greater expense and the seemingly antithetical necessity of foreign expertise and technologies, the metro's planners chose to build tunnels and stations deeper underground than those in many other systems. Chiefly this was because it would provide the room for vaulting spaces and impressive platforms. And this decision was posed in explicit opposition to metro systems that, while technologically superior, were deemed inelegant because of their fiscal restraint. Soviet commentators insisted that New York's unadorned stations in particular looked unfinished. I guess some things never change. And as though they were designed in slavish obedience to economy. By contrast, the Moscow Metro, in accordance with an enigmatic and terse mandate issued by the party, was to be, quote unquote, beautiful. No expense would be spared and nothing would be done the easy way. While the party would have to absorb the cost of difficult construction through unforgiving sentiment, some of it being a lot like quicksand, the actual labor was done painstakingly with archaic tools by a largely untrained peasant population, much of which had recently moved to Moscow specifically for the promise of working on the metro. Even though employment was otherwise scarce, working conditions and pay were so poor that in the first 9 months of construction in 1932, out of 17,137 workers, 11,999 left the job. What follows was a concerted effort to propagandize the construction of the metro along quasi-military lines. The Metrostroy invested heavily in film, photography, newspaper articles, plays, poetry, and more to attract workers to the site and to make the metro a point of city and union-wide pride. Posters by the likes of Gustav Klutzis rallied everyone to work on the metro, and indeed there were such things as volunteer days for digging the tunnels, organized by the Komsomol, the youth wing of the party, which was also involved in organizing dances in the metro's honor, as well as athletics competitions. There were even banners and photo murals extolling the metro workers inside the tunnels that were in the process of being built. And of course, these peculiar mise en scène en abîme were designed for photographic circulation to the wider public. Throughout construction, stories appeared everywhere in the press about the education and civilized, modern, and collective living designed by all those who did their part. Invariably, these stories would detail the frogged prince tale of someone described as an exceedingly particular provincial arriving in the big city with the folksy accoutrement of a wooden spoon and traditional dress, only to emerge from the industrial womb of the metro as a living, breathing emissary from the Soviet Union's bright future. Metro workers became heroes and the first true Soviets by being forged through their hard labor and terrible working conditions. Kaganovich stated, quote, "I contend that Moscow will be, in effect, the laboratory where the whole Soviet Union can come to study and acquire a socialist education," end quote. The worker was to be changed by his work. The transformation of that backward-looking subject mystified by their own history into a collective-minded modern working toward building a better tomorrow was always the moral of the story. And this also held true for those who did not work on the metro but only used it after it opened. According to newspaper and radio reports, the metro's opening day saw full compliance with the list of rules published governing behavior on the metro. On May 16, 1935, the day after 285,000 passengers rode the metro for the first time, Pravda, a newspaper, reported that, quote, "not a single cigarette butt was thrown on the floor," end quote. The surfaces of the metro spoke of a dream of untrammeled consumption through unlimited production. The interiors recycled historical building elements and styles from Egypto-Grecian columns to Roman arches and barrel-vaulted and coffered ceilings to luxurious semi-Baroque ornament to sleekly streamlined Ottoman-inspired pendentive domes, all made of the finest materials. The gray marble used at Sokolniki Station reminded one architect of chinchilla fur, and no less a figure than Nikita Khrushchev insisted that the marble used in the Red Gate Station, quote, "can best be described as the color of raw meat," end quote. The metro transformed those who built and those who used it by promising that each individual could find a new and better life as part of the collective as Stalinism defined it. It was their metro, their city, their Soviet Union, their world to remake, but to remake in a very specific way. Reacting to an especially dim proposed lighting scheme for a station, Kaganovich wrote to its designers, quote, "Give us more realistic lighting. These aren't churches, after all," end quote. For historian Mikhail Ricklin, this suggests the desire to present the metro and the collective will it embodied and forged as a naturalized state of being. Michael O'Mani makes a similar argument that the metro sought to install in the geological record of Moscow a pseudoscientific archaeology of the Soviet soul, as though to tell the story that workers had simply discovered the new world, rather than its being the product of careful planning and labor. Each of these understands myth in the metro as a distortion layered over reality, an obfuscating wool pulled over our eyes, and so each criticism is exactly wrong. The metro did not naturalize culture by installing it underground. It made war on nature, replacing it with obviously fabricated works of culture. When Kaganovich asked for more realistic lighting, he was asking for socialist realistic lighting. And taking a wide-angle view of the visual and media culture of the 1930s, as we have begun to do here, should make this abundantly clear. But what is socialist realist lighting, and how does it relate to the function of myth in the metro? Evidently, lighting in the metro was to be bright. Moscow lighting was twice as bright as that in London's underground, but bright in a way that was neither strictly illusionistic nor referential. Plans that suggested optically that the ceiling open to the sky were rejected, as was any plan that foregrounded the deep undergroundness of the metro, for example, painting the ceiling black. Ricklin describes the situation perfectly when he writes, quote, "The architect had to create a palatial space truly present somewhere on Earth, but ideally away from any specific location, a utopia. Realizing this utopia literally was the architect's task," end quote. But the specific character of this realized socialist realist utopia is that it is an actual literal space that conquers nature and replaces it with consciously constructed culture. In the metro, the daytime of utopia is the electrified night because it refers to the ability to remake the world. Mythology here is not a distortion of reality, but actually produces it. In discussing Soviet photographic practice from the 1920s and 30s, Leah Dickerman emphasizes the legibility of censorship. She writes, quote, "Paradoxically, the revolutionary rhetoric of a total break with the past coexisted with a series of historical reversals. History's status as a given was fundamentally shaken. During the mid-1920s, the period in which the model of socialist realism developed, one sees much self-conscious thinking about historical self-construction." End quote. The manipulation of the past is part of how socialist realism understands the composition of reality in the present. She continues, quote, "While what we might normally understand as censorship exists beneath the realm of visibility, what is particularly remarkable in these examples is how the censor's hand is insistently marked." Unquote. Censorship always intentionally displays itself as such. And even seamless manipulation would have been read as marked by the censor's hand when earlier versions of images were well known. This would be true for the most technically adept altered photographs and for the imagined realities of socialist realist painting, which shared the task of depicting utopia here and now. Dickerman points to Isaac Brodsky's painting, Lenin giving a speech to troops departing for the Polish front on the 5th of May, 1920, which we see here. The original photograph, which included Leon Trotsky and Lev Kamenev on the steps to the right there, would have been well known to contemporary audiences, and so would have the photograph's second iteration printed and disseminated after Stalin outmaneuvered Trotsky to replace Lenin. Even that invisible photographic subtraction of Trotsky and Kamenev would have been read as such. The painted version then repeats the excision, and what's more, Brodsky injects just enough of the artist's hand to transform the 13-year-old event into a present utopian vision. The censored photograph, socialist realist paintings, and the metro share a threshold temporality because they all project a future by relying on knowledge or images of what has been in order to describe a current state of affairs, which itself is fundamentally oriented toward the future. That is, the obvious manipulation of these images is meant to work toward a constructed reality in the present and future by conspicuously wielding images from the past. And the more conspicuous that manipulation, the more difficult it is to determine where the present ends and the future begins. In this way, the metro is a three-dimensional embodiment of what Alain Badiou describes as a linguistic shelter. This self-reflexive construction of the present, which is designed to be read as such, entails that the future is undecided and subject to human agency. Badiou writes, quote, "It is thus in the nature of declarations to invent a future for the present of art. This rhetorical invention of a future which is on its way to existing in the shape of an act is a useful and necessary thing in politics and art as well as in love, where the 'I love you forever' is the patently surrealist manifesto of an uncertain act. This projective rhetoric describes a linguistic shelter for what takes place without, however, either naming or grasping it." End quote. For Badiou, this relationship between the declarative construction of the present and its relation to projective statements regarding the future animates all major political and artistic projects of the 20th century. According to him, quote, "The century has viewed itself as the in-between of trace and destination. The century is the transit, the mobility of the threshold, but never its crossing." End quote. But the Moscow Metro, with socialist realism as its politico-aesthetic imperative, succeeded in reorganizing daily life and stands as a monument to the possibility of doing so for that very reason. Not just because it was actually built, but because it formed a crux for a total reworking of fundamental categories through which all life was to be understood. Or, as Greuze puts it, "The artists of the Russian avant-garde did not regard their works as contemplations or revelations, but as projects for restructuring the very context of everyday life and all its institutions. And this restructuring was accomplished in reality by Stalin." End quote. Stalinism crossed the threshold. If the metro is utopia realized, we should remember the nature of this utopia. It is a frictionless world infinitely responsive to human agency. Crossing the threshold in socialist realist terms, then, ironically, produces a stagnant present. When the past can simply be rewritten in the service of the future, the present vanishes. We should think of the metro as a three-dimensional socialist realist painting with moving parts, some mechanical and some human. This translation of the plastic realization of utopia from 2 to 3 dimensions means that everyone passing through the system enters a state of suspended animation. And it means that the metro itself elaborates a logic of stasis more than one of motion. Whether one moves quickly through the station to reach the platform or strolls more casually admiring the surrounds is beside the point, because there will always be another train and it will go to the same place. Thanks.
Kathleen Holzer will be talking today. The title of her talk is "The Right Look and the Right to Look," all about this issue of the visual landscape and who's controlling it. So welcome, Kathleen Holzer.
Thanks. Cannot see the mouse. Where are you, mouse? Where are you? Can't see it. Oh, there it is. Okay, that's where I'd like to be. So, the right to look and the right look. Billboards are an example of the new visual environments created by consumer capitalism. And it's one of the arenas in which there's an enormous friction between commerce and culture that shape new habits of seeing. But the revolution in perceptual habits associated with advertising led to a corresponding legal revolution that drove a wedge for visual rights in public space. And so what I'm going to do in the following few minutes, if you're not too exhausted from intense, cool papers, is to probe some of the issues that spring from the public response to billboards and outdoor advertising. And these issues illuminate conflicts between public and private interests in the clashes over public space. And they mark a battle in scopic regimes associated with urban development and car culture, but this happens in suburban spaces and also in urban spaces. So it's sort of interesting to watch the two arenas happen. And I borrow, you know, when I use the word scopic regimes, you're going to recognize some film language, and so I'm borrowing some of the language and analysis that people use for film, because there's a sense in which outdoor advertisements are a time-based medium, but it's just that you're either walking or driving by them as opposed to having them unspool in front of you. So to state the problem, at least from the point of view of the reformers, is proliferation. By, you know, Barnum and Bailey are certainly putting up a lot of circus posters in the mid-19th century, but it's really in the later 19th century that outdoor advertising begins to get really, really large and really seemingly plastered all over everything. And it has to do with the rise of national brands, that there's national brands that begin to use advertising, and then there's national companies that come along to use it. So by 1906, there were already 75,000 electric signs across the US, which is just one type of outdoor advertising. And these were usually initially baked enamel, surrounded by the bulbs, and then after that came neons. And the billboard stands, those poster stands that are freestanding, those go back and quite a ways to the 19th century, and they come in various sheet sizes, but they ended up getting larger and larger, and you could just put together more sheets to put together a larger advertisement. So the scale of things is something that seemed to bother people, in addition to the quantity, actual quantity of signs. And then there's also the painted brick wall sign. And in that, the advertisers benefited from developments in urban architecture. As the buildings got larger, to the delight of the advertiser, the canvas for the painted brick wall sign got larger as well. So you need a biscuit, which you know as this little fellow here, and other companies like Quaker Oats and so on took advantage of this, Bull Durham and so on. And as this went on, there began to be more and more people who were attacking these signs. And as they were attacked, the advertisers began to claim the right to advertise and replied that citizens cannot legislate aesthetics. And this is something we're going to hear about for a good long time. So this is an example of some of the ads you might have seen. The Park Place, this was the Metropole Hotel right across from City Hall. And you basically see the building all dressed here. This is a pizza with everything on it. And it has a few of the things that are hot button issues for people. Up top there, that you can see not terribly well in the top left, is an advertisement from a leading corset company. They advertised in Times Square as well. And gigantic understatements, as I call this genre of ad, were one of the reasons that reformers in the 19th century began to get upset, because underwear was a big category of advertising. So the Heather Bloom Company that advertised petticoats, one of the things you could do when advertising petticoats is, of course, display the female limb. I would never call it a leg in the 19th century. It's a limb. And the Heather Bloom did an electric display in which a petticoat wearing girl with a parasol actually went across a tightrope in Times Square. And this sign was beloved by many because it, you know, it actually took place over time. It was animated, but it was also decried as an example of the, you know, the incredible, you know, decline in public morals and public values and so on. That here was a girl whose skirts are well above her knees. She's up there, you know, 50 feet in the air, and, you know, you're just standing there gawking at her with, you know, no no scruples whatsoever. And, you know, what's on her legs? It's light bulbs, you know, practically nothing. So it's really bad, it's getting bad, and it's the advertiser's fault. So the foes, who are the foes in this battle? The people who don't like it. Well, the people who don't like it, they line up in a few different ranks here. And some of the players are the American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society. And to those of you who are urbanists, you might recognize a couple names in the American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society. Andrew Haswell Green, associated with our beloved square, not rectangular, Central Park. And Edward Hageman Hall, who you might recognize as a big proponent of murals. And the honorary president of the Scenic Society, who was J.P. Morgan, known for some of the other stuff that he did. They were particularly big on the way in which if you protected American scenes and history, you would help history, and you would also be patriotic. So there were a lot of sons of the American Revolution in it, a lot of daughters of the American Revolution in it, and that sort of brings out the degree to which a lot of the people who were doing the bill posting were people of Irish and German extraction, and a lot of the people who were doing the critique of the bill posting were of the Protestant Anglo-white persuasion. One of the other people associated with the Scenic and Preservation Society will give you an idea of another angle on this. His name was Horace McFarland, and he was a close associate of John Muir and big in the National Parks movement. So they're in just this little, you know, small part of the anti-billboard movement. You get a sense that there's people who favor architecture, there's people who favor patriotism, there's people who like history, there's people who like the WASP heritage, and there's people who like nature and the environment, and those things, you know, sort of continue, and then they don't all add up to the same thing. They're a batch of different reasons. Another group that was really, really active against billboards, and they kind of tug at my heartstrings, is the automobile clubs. A lot of people, you know, perhaps later on thought of the automobile people as sort of desecrators because they were a road lobby, but in fact, they were a big and very strong advocate of getting rid of the billboards because the early automobile clubs were into touring, and so they wanted to go out and see the scenery. And one of my favorite moments, and this is the only moment that I could truly call revolutionary in this particular resume of the history of billboards, is when there was they got a law, their lobby got a law passed in 1911 that allowed any illegal sign to be taken down, removed, or destroyed by anyone if it was on private property. And the Automobile Club issued a kind of a free-for-all manifesto circular to its members, and they all got together in the clubs and they drove the roads in groups with axes, and they had ladders. Some of them went out with fire hooks on poles and stuff, and they started destroying all the signs that they could find and just ripping them down and, you know, tearing them down, and apparently they had a great time. And some of the women, I kind of have the suspicion, were the daughters of Carrie Nation, because they concentrated on the sinful cigar and liquor ads, you know, and they targeted those in particular. So, you know, when you hear what they went after, it gives you a sense again of the reform movement. There was not just that the billboards stood in front of, you know, some particularly nice stands of birches and azaleas. It was also what was on the signs was problematic. So clearly they were not taking enough omega oil, which, you know, as a patent medicine was clearly something that was very, very good for you. You know, you really didn't know what it did. There was no truth in advertising at the time, but it was ubiquitous, and you can still see omega oil signs in some of the boroughs on some of the brick wall signs. So the response to these critiques, the third party, not last but most important in a way, is the Municipal Art Society. And in conjunction with the Roadside Council, which was a roadside reform group, the Municipal Art Society, based in New York, focused on architecture and cityscape. And they had quite a few people who were trying to fix the city by changing local politics. And so they had people who were lawyers on staff. And there was one fellow in particular, Albert Bard, who seemed to have devoted almost his very long life, almost the whole of it, to trying to get rid of signs. And it's very interesting to see what happens as the Municipal Art Society ties itself into knots on the outbreak of a garish yellow, red, and orange, which is all over public space, along with the horrifying suggestion of lips which will chew chewing gum at a scale that is most disturbing to the soul in the city. And so one of the largest advertising companies in New York was run by a fellow who founded his company in Brooklyn, Oscar Good. And the O.J. Good Company controlled about, by the 20s, he had about 10,000 billboards, but he was a very large advertiser in Times Square. But O.J. Good was a real club man, and so he understood that in order to deal with something like the Municipal Art Society, you didn't really want to go up against them like a Tammany Hall politician. What you wanted to do was, be a club man and kind of get on the same committee with them. So the Municipal Art Society figures that it will try to elevate public taste, and maybe they're going to have to live with these billboards because advertising is something that's part of the business culture. And so what they're going to do is try to improve them. And so they actually sponsor an exhibit, and lo and behold, whose company is the one who's featured in this exhibit when the Municipal Art Society in 1905 gets an exhibit of billboards to show you what good taste in advertising might possibly be? Of course, it's O.J. Good. And so here's an O.J. Good sign. It's one of his most famous ones. It was on the west side of Times Square in 1917. And what you can particularly notice about this, because I'm in an audience who probably knows how we celebrated the first big Columbian celebration in Chicago, is the way in which, maybe Columbus did not chew Wrigley's gum, but this lighting scheme is so like the lighting scheme that you had at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. O.J. Good was responding to the critiques, and he just wanted to, give it back to the aesthetic people who said, signs were vulgar and horrible, and he wanted to tell them, even though I'm using electricity, I can be very artistic with it, and I can do festoons and garlands and, urns, and, I can make it like a fountain of light, and, really this is classical, don't you think? Another way you could be classical is to, use actual classical architecture. So this was another response to the billboard foes. And if you look closely, these figures here are called Lizzies. And that was that came in the 20s specifically in response to these reform efforts. And they were put in little architectural features there, kind of like columns or maybe caryatides on the sides of the stands of billboards. And that was, again, part of the uplifting public taste and, helping people to perhaps see the billboards as being part of a rhetoric of art rather than part of that vulgar trend that was going to make public taste just go to the dogs. The other piece of the public objection that persisted through the billboard wars as they go on is the morals objection. There's the aesthetic objection and the morals objection. So Janssen, which is a fairly early big advertiser, is one of the ones who's sort of on the forefront of getting critiqued for exposing too much flesh. And one of the ways they finesse their particular problem with this is that they claim that their bathing suits are the ones that changed bathing to swimming. And whenever you're seeing too much flesh here, even though she does have her swimming stockings and her swimming cap on, is what you're seeing there is actually, it's healthy sport, and it's not something that's, a bathing beauty. It's somebody who's engaging in recreation and health. So this is from 1924. So we're still in the midst of this kind of battle. So Albert Bard, the guy I mentioned, who was the lawyer from the Municipal Art Society in New York, he spends a good deal of time trying to manufacture aesthetic arguments, then they can't get them to stand up in court. He can't get a law to hold that will say, you can make a law that says billboards are, desecrate the city, they're too ugly, and they're ruining this space. And so they try to say that billboards are unhealthy, they might fall down, or that people hide behind them to have sex is one of the arguments they give. They didn't get very far with that one. And then they use, then again, they try to tax them out of existence, and this is sort of the sin tax method of attacking the billboard like you use on, cigarettes today and liquor and so on. And he seems to constantly be facing setbacks, and so the movement is constantly facing setbacks because the people who are engaged in national advertising find that it's not just that they have a great deal of political power and that advertising itself is fairly popular in the United States. It's also that the billboard advertisers are themselves very capable of influencing the people who get into office and stay in office, as you can see from this particular poster, which would not fly perhaps in today's campaigns, but nevertheless is reminiscent of certain campaign themes that we see. And so the practice of the billboard industry of donating free space to people who are going to be elected at state level, local level, county level, and further on up is one that ensured that laws that were unfavorable to the advertisers just didn't happen to get passed very often. So after many decades of legislative battles, part of which get defeated not just because of the political power of the advertisers, but because signs themselves have become so deeply embedded in the way people see the landscape and the way they travel through the landscape, and they become iconic, like the Apollo sign, to name one. There's a case called Berman and Parker that makes its way to the Supreme Court. And it's William O. Douglas who actually rules on it, and it's a case that centers on urban blight. So it's not totally a case that's about billboards, but in effect it's one that's the first case that's the sort of dividing line about whether aesthetic values are part of the government responsibility for public welfare. And in this 1954 decision, Douglas wrote that the concept of the public welfare is broad and inclusive, and the values it represents are spiritual as well as physical, aesthetic as well as monetary. And it is within the power of the legislature to determine that the community should be beautiful as well as healthy, spacious as well as well-balanced. And it can then, the Berman versus Parker opinion then affirmed that that an aesthetic public purpose is constitutional, and it was used in justifying urban renewal in Washington, D.C. to counteract blight. But fundamentally, that was the basis for all kinds of aesthetic regulation thereafter. So interestingly, these developments arose from pressures to keep the suburbs free of the clutter of advertising that suburbanites hoped they would escape by moving away from urban, uncontrolled environments. And ironically, these suburban enclaves are the ones in which the stress on individual property rights was actually the greatest. However, the laws that regulate these signs are actually ones that posit a type of collective visual rights that appeal to group and community values. And it's such a different sensibility that you can really, when you look at them, and there's quite a body of legislation that's happened since that '54 Supreme Court decision, what you come up with is a body of law that in some ways is some of the most socialist kind of legislation imaginable. And much of it was created to protect some of the most wealthy and upper class suburban enclaves in the United States, which were created to be, basically refuges from places where uncontrolled individual property rights meant that business could put up anything it wanted to. So meanwhile, back at the ranch, what was happening very shortly after the Supreme Court decision on the aesthetic side is people like Ed Ruscha swims into view as part of the pop art movement and is seemingly an admirer of the gas station and the roadside. And it's no longer a desecration, but an object of considerable interest, possibly of veneration. Likewise, James Rosenquist, who originally, before he was madly successful as an artist, worked for Art Crafts Strauss, the company that originally owned a great deal of the signs that were put up in Times Square, and he was a member of the Sign Painters Union. So, he originally got, his chops on painting very large-scale stuff by working on Times Square signs up on scaffolding. So these fellows start to pick up on this stuff, and they begin to develop an entirely different track in perceptual habits in which the postmodern embrace of the roadscape and the collage cityscape gain a lot of traction. So Times Square. Since I brought up Times Square, that's kind of the last interesting twist in this, which is Times Square development then the place goes down and becomes a metaphor by the 1970s for everything that's gone wrong for the city. So it becomes a place that the city fathers want to redevelop. And they start to get plans for redeveloping it. And as many people in this room probably know, their initial plans are it's all going to be very clean and modernist and uncluttered, and they'll get rid of the tawdry, garish, glaring stuff. And not very much time goes by before they begin to realize, and foremost among those seemingly realizing this is the Municipal Art Society, the leader of the Billboard foes a mere 60 years earlier. They begin to realize that the unique character of Times Square comes from its collage of signs, from the brightness of its lights. It invents a new term in urbanism called the Light Unit Times Square, the LUTS, L-U-T-S, which is now used by urbanists. And when people like Morgan Stanley move in there, they buy a bankrupt building in 1993, and they think they got a pretty good deal on it, and they think they're going to go with the redevelopment thing. It's not clear that Times Square is going to be what you know it is now. When they open the building, they get Charles Guathmy and Massimo Vignelli to design their facade because they have to meet the brightness and sign regulations, and their negotiations with the rule makers over the sign regulations are quite hilarious because they bring this whole issue of what the right look in the city is with all its contradictions right to the table, because they say, well, we're a financial institution, and it's really not very comfortable for us when we're trying to project an image of solidity and dependability and stability to have, the whole facade of the place be all these blinking, flashing signs and so on. So couldn't we just have the facade, be the nice skyscraper that Guathmy, made for us, and we'll have the stuff turned off during the day, and then when we go home at night, we'll turn the signs on. Will that meet your rules? And they were told, no, that's not good enough. And so Guathmy and Siegel, came up with what is the famous You can't see it in this picture, unfortunately. I did not get the picture I wanted. A blue, rounded kind of drum that has a map of all the Morgan Stanley offices, and it's LED lights, and it's more like, you know, what you see in the later Barclays Bank with tickers and LEDs. And so the rhetoric basically changed so completely around that, you know, Morgan Stanley kind of had to get with the program. And you can see the revolution in visual habits by how Municipal Art Society went from making sure that there wasn't too much yellow, red, garishness and wattage out in public space so that people could be inspired, to actually turning around and requiring J.P. Morgan's bank to have it. So this kind of collage perception then, which I've called in the suburban context in a tribute to Baudelaire and Benjamin, the eye of the chauffeur flaneur, has overturned tastes and jumbled perceptual elements. And I would like to conclude by saying I think the history of billboards leads you to the revolutionary realization that the changing mix of advertising imagery has itself become part of the design and pattern of the American landscape. Thank you.